Thank you very much to everyone for coming along to the event tonight. It's quite a different topic to the things that we've typically had at the Edinburgh group events in the past. In the few years I've been involved, we've not had anything related to sports yet. So I think it'll be quite interesting to hear, a bit of sort of different topic and some different applications for statistics. The event is going to be recorded, so just so as everyone is aware, and it'll then should be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly after the event. So if you know of anyone that was keen to come but wasn't available, then you can direct them towards our YouTube channel and it'll be available there. If you have questions, which I hope some of you will, then if you can stay muted during the talks and pop any questions that you have for the speakers in the chat box, then I'll pass them on to the speakers at the end of each talk. Without any further ado, we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers. We've got, first up is Guy Wilkinson, who is a lecturer in sport at the University of Stirling, and he's going to talk about individual player contributions in European football and how we can quantify this. So I'm just going to pass over to Guy and let him get going.
Cool. I'll just set up. Thanks, David. Cool. I think you can see that okay?
Yep, that looks good. Thanks.
Cool. Excellent. So, yeah, thanks for inviting me along. I'm Guy Wilkinson. I'm a lecturer in sport at the University of Stirling. My background originally as a statistician before going on to do a PhD in sports economics. And so I've kind of got a bit of both of those backgrounds in this presentation. And my title, Individual Player Contributions in European Football, I'll motivate this just so you get an idea of what I'm exactly meaning by this. So this is on a paper that I started working on for my PhD thesis, and I've spent a bit more time trying to update it and upgrade it. And the paper focuses on producing models with a high prediction rate in professional football using individual player contributions. And the main thing on this model that I'm making is that it avoids arbitrary model selection decisions. So quite often when people look at estimating the productivity, let's say, of football players, they make a lot of arbitrary decisions. They put a lot of weighting on individual statistics that players have, and there's a lot of judgment that goes into it. So I'm creating a model which basically creates pretty much no judgments in terms of the players. It just tries to estimate outright what their contributions are. And it comes from a labor economics background where typically it's often difficult to assess the contributions of workers when their productivity is unobserved or they're part of a team. So in a typical business, you might find that it's hard really to tell who might necessarily contribute what towards the output of a business, especially when they're all working on a team and information isn't tracked. And even in football or sport in general, where it's quite good for us to test any theories in labor economics because we have a quite often observable productivity. So for footballers, we can watch them on a pitch and see how they're performing. We can even track statistics. But even so, it's still difficult to identify contributions to team outcomes from specific players. But if we have contributions and we're able to estimate these, in theory, we can use them to predict results and could also rank players, managers, teams, or leagues. And that's really what I'm going to aim to do with this paper. So just a very small bit on the backgrounds. So fixed effects allow for a measure of within group variation over time. So that's first really looked at in sport by Stefan Szymanski and Ron Smith. And they built kind of papers based on this. And the issue is, though, if you have too many fixed effects where so typically in sport, you would look at teams and look at the underlying productivity that teams bring, and those would be your fixed effects. But if we're doing this for now players and managers and so on, you might get a lot of linearity concerns that can occur with the fixed effects. But potentially we can aim to resolve this issue somewhat because there's a lot of movement within the data. And this movement within the data comes from a paper by Abaud, Kramars, and Margolis, where they looked at about 1 million workers in France across 50,000 French industries. And they basically tracked the workers over time, how many businesses they moved through and so on, and used that to estimate their productivity. And we can think about this being quite nice in sport, because if you think in football in particular, players can transfer between different teams. Even within teams themselves, players move in and out of the lineup. So because players are constantly in and out of specific games and also transferring between different teams and different leagues, we do have a lot of movement in the data. And that means because there's a lot of separation of the players, in theory, we can get rid of a lot of that linearity, although not always, because quite a lot of players do actually come in at the same time of each other. But in theory, we could see how that would perform. So for this analysis, I need to basically produce a high dimension matrix. So what I'm going to use is 41,000 games approximately, and we're going to have from that about 21,000 unique players, almost 2,000 unique managers, and 593 unique teams. So there's quite a lot of information there. And if I'm going to give them all fixed effects in the model, then we're looking at 23,000 fixed effects variables. And if we're putting that all together with the number of games, we're looking at close to about 2 billion individual cells. So it becomes quite computationally intense in order to analyze. So for that reason, I'm going to use sparse matrices and using the GLMNet package, if you're familiar with it, on R. And what that does basically is any zeros in the matrix, which there will be plenty because it will be a bunch of fixed effects when players and managers are in specific games, it codes them in such a way that it takes up a lot less memory, and we're able to do the analysis because of that. So we cannot use typical ordinary least squares methods to produce the fixed effects because of the multicollinearity. So even though the estimates are unbiased, the variances are quite large, which deviates the observed value from the true value. So I can't really use that as a reliable means of estimating the contributions. So I'm going to use high dimension regression techniques instead, which do give a degree of bias to the regression estimates, but this helps to reduce the variance of the estimates and give us more accurate results. I'll use a couple. So ridge regression is one that I'll use. And what's nice about that is that it does shrink the value of the coefficients, but doesn't perform feature selection. So in theory, every fixed effect variable that I put in will have a coefficient that corresponds to it. I'm also going to use lasso and an extension of it that can shrink the coefficients as well to 0, which don't seemingly matter in terms of prediction. So it does do a bit of variable selection where some players that they think are not necessarily performing well will be given a 0 coefficient. And then there's elastic net, which is a mix of ridge regression and lasso, but also drops out some of the coefficients to 0. And these have typically been known throughout literature, not just in sports economics or statistics, but beyond, to do quite well when predicting under high dimensional circumstances. So here's the model that I'm going to present for today. It's a fairly simple model. So the idea is that you have the goal difference between two teams on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you have just a bunch of fixed effects variables. So you have the home advantage for when a team plays at home. You have the first 11 players for both teams. So they'll have fixed effects corresponding to players who are in and out for them. Same with the managers, same with the teams. And I'm also going to bring in league strength coefficients so that I'm able to try and balance how strong teams are between leagues. Because if there's no crossover, then it can be hard to determine the difference between a player in England and a player in Spain, for example. So really, it's just a bunch of fixed effects variables. And the only variable I'm really taking from games is the goal difference from the game. That's the only variable that I'm using as an estimate. And what the data then looks like is I'm going to use player lineups from European football competitions. So I've taken lineups from 25 European leagues. So at the time that I did the analysis, I ranked the top 25 leagues by the UEFA coefficients. And I took 6 years of their lineups from 2013-14 to 2018-19. And also I included the group and knockout stages for European competitions, of which I have most of them. But just as a caveat, there is 2 years missing from it because the website that I was getting the information from changed, so it became harder to find it. So keep that in mind when we look at the results at the end as well. But overall, this is basically 41,000 individual games. And I'm going to use those basically to see as players move between the leagues, move between the teams, moving in and out of the teams in order to analyze and produce some results. So coefficients are solely derived from the goal difference. I'm going to use 5 of those 6 seasons as training data to predict results for the 18-19 season. In order to try and reduce some of the fixed effects, I'm basically going to make an assumption that I will only include players for which 35 games have been played. So all the other players will drop into a baseline indicator. So basically all the players that come out will be their ability above and beyond baseline level players. And then I know as well that models quite often tend to have issues predicting with draws in football. So when you're looking at the goal difference, obviously a goal difference of 0 is a draw. So it's far rarer than it is for any team to win and lose. So what I'm going to do is use historic win, draw, loss percentages for those leagues in order to use as a baseline to try and predict. So if a league had 30% draws previously, I'm going to constrain my output so that the closest 30% of games will be predicted as a draw, and hope that that helps to improve its performance. And this is what I did. So don't mind too much by how much data is on the table here. That's just showing you basically all the leagues. We have a number of games, but what I want you to really just focus on is the fact that you tend to go, in some cases, you might get bad predictive accuracy in Switzerland down at around 26%, but it can go up to around 52%, although it hovers somewhere around 45%. So if you were to run the model, that tends to be where you're at, generally around the 40% prediction rate for it. And so this is what it looks like as an average, 45.5%, but it does have quite a wide range from 26% to 52%, depending on the league itself. And all the models actually perform quite similarly on their prediction rate and with a similar standard deviation across the leagues. So there's not a huge amount of difference between whatever method you use to do the regression. And that's really what we've got at the moment. So the next thing I'll do is I'll bring through a confusion matrix just to show you that it is quite hard to predict the draws. So I've got about 27.73% of observed draws are actually predicted as draws. But for the losses, I'm getting a lot higher. So the difficulty when you're predicting in a sport like this is that, of course, you can predict the wins and losses generally a bit more easily, and the wins in particular. But the draws are the ones that are really hard to predict, and most models tend to struggle with this. And it's no surprise as well that this model is struggling with that a bit more too. But then you might ask, well, 45%, 26%, and 52%, what is actually determined as a good prediction rate for football? And my argument for that would probably be this here, is that we need to compare it against generally what we think is the industry's best at making predictions. So that leads me to betting firms. And betting firms do use market knowledge. They have a lot of information prior to matches in order to make their estimates and their predictions. There are no algorithms that generally perform consistently better than those used by betting firms. There might be one or two, perhaps by some statisticians out there, but by and large, the betting firms are in business and they dominate it because they are better than everyone else. But if the models then perform similarly to those produced by betting firms, then there's applications we can have beyond just predictive accuracy. And I've gone onto a website called Odds Portal, which it says can consider up to 12 betting firms. I think it's gone up to about 30 since I first brought through some of these. It basically takes all the odds, and I'm going to use them and bring them through and see what would happen if I, compared my model against them. So this graph here, what I've done is essentially, imagine the Premier League has 380 games a season, and I was to put £1 on every single game with what the model predicted. So this is, in this case, I believe, the Lasso model. If I put £1 on it, if I lost, the prediction, I would lose £1. If I won, I would get a payout back on, the amount that the firm's paying out. So I've taken the average odds from all the betting firms and basically put my £1 against every single game. And each week there are 10 games, and the week number is just, each match day week. So each week there's 10 games, and I've given a cumulative measure of my profit or loss here. So you can see that over time, if you're using the average odds, you might do okay in particular weeks. It kind of fluctuates. But over time in England, certainly you get towards the end where you're getting about a negative £12 loss over the 380 games a season. So it's a small loss, but still fairly close to the betting firms. You can have it where the losses become a bit more extreme. So for example, in France, it's the same idea. The model is trying to estimate in the same way, but it's struggling to compare against France. But also what's quite interesting is that Germany, for example, made a profit. So 34 match weeks in Germany, and it actually did quite well compared to the average betting firms there. And then likewise, I'll just bring through to show you the last big 5 leagues, as they're known, the top 5 leagues in Europe. Spain made a profit, as you can see, over time, and then Italy made a loss. So for me, looking through this, I haven't really been able to identify how you can tell which league will perform well or not with the model. But what I can tell is if you were to combine them, generally on average, the model does do a little bit worse than the betting firms. But considering this is about 1,800 games, having a loss of £24 over, the 1,800 that you brought in isn't terrible, I would say. So I'm quite confident at least that it's making reasonable estimates. But what I can do as well, I noticed on the site, is that if you look at all the betting firms, you can find who's offering the best odds for any individual game. So I think a lot of people do this generally when they're betting. They want to put a bet on, they'll look to see who's giving them the best return on it, so they'll bet with that company. And if I did adjust that for England, for example, because I've not got all of this through at the moment, but it did turn the amount earned into a profit at the time. And I think the return was about, it improves on average about 3%, I think. So what I did then was decide, well, okay, I don't have all the data yet, but let's say it's between 3 and 3.5%, a better payout using the best odds. I would add that to all the leagues and see how much that would change things. And if you look, I'll put this through in a table just to separate the models now. Assuming that 3 to 3.5% improvement by using the best odds, you actually do make a profit, albeit very, very small for every single league. So, you know, I could say to Dayfair, for example, if you gave me 1,800, that I could get them £37 in return at the end of the season. So it's not like a great return, obviously, at the end of the day, because it's about, you know, I'm looking at a 2% return, but at least it's better than, you know, some of the interest accounts, the checking accounts. So there's that. But, you know, if you're going to spend all this time making the model, you don't really want a 2% return. And that's why I generally advise not to gamble on sports, because it's, you know, quite hard to make a very big return from it unless you get particularly lucky. The last thing then I'll cover is that I've mentioned the individual contributions. So you're probably asking me, well, who did well? Who came out the model to be particularly good? I've got two specifications here. If I just take the player coefficient in specification 1, that is the ability of a player in their normal playing conditions. But if I was to combine that with the team and the league coefficients, then in theory, that would give you the true ability of the player, because it takes into account where they're playing and the team that they're on and the productivities associated with them. So what I'm going to do now to end with is just bring through a table looking at the players who have come out top for both of these specifications. I'll admit that I've looked at some of them, but I don't know all of them. So if you're fans of some of these leagues, you might recognize some of them or I don't. So please feel free in the chat to say if they actually are okay or they're terrible. But bear in mind, this is up to 2017-18 and, you know, where they would go on after that. So if we're looking at the overall players, they come out from, like, Manchester City has quite a few. Arsenal keeper, David Alaba has been quite popular. Sadio Mane from Liverpool. Surprising ones, Marvin Comper. Anyone who's a Celtic fan here knows that he didn't really break into the team. But at the time when he joined, I think it was Red Bull Leipzig, he did actually play all the games and help them get into the Champions League. So as far as the data set went, you know, he did do well at the time. But it shows you that it can be subject to, you know, the years that you cut it off with, and not every player is necessarily going to work out because he got injured. For managers, obviously a lot of good managers there. Some managers come through have actually performed really well at teams who are thought of as not being particularly good. So Alaves, for example, in Spain, the managers have come through quite well because they qualified for La Liga and then came almost into the Champions League position their first season there. So that's why they're quite high up. I'll highlight this one. I think James might know, Paul Clement. I think he saved Swansea from relegation and did really well, and then went to Reading afterwards and did terribly. But maybe you can tell me about that in the questions afterwards. But it tends to pick out, basically, even though it's not, you know, who you'd think is the best player ever, it tends to pick out good players, good managers, or teams you'd expect to get the most out of their players. And then finally, if you were to just take the players on their own, you'll notice that there's a lot of names here you might not necessarily recognize, because these are players who perform well in their normal playing conditions. So it brings through a lot of players who are from leagues that you might not necessarily watch, or perhaps it's easier for them to stand out in. And I've had a look at this. Some of the players, some of them have gone on to play for better teams and gone up to the leagues. Some of them have dropped out and been injured. So it's no guarantee that the player's obviously going to be well, but it can certainly help you shortlist players who might actually be worth looking at if you couldn't, for example, send your scouting department around to the Czech League or the Cypriot League, where some of these players come from, or the Belarusian League. And then, of course, the same with the managers and the teams, showing ones who are not necessarily saying they're the best teams by the coefficients, but they tend to, you know, get their players performing better than they should do, estimated by their abilities. So just to conclude then, the regression techniques perform similarly, but there's a high prediction variability between leagues. Models which predict draws tend to maybe have lower predictive accuracy than those who predict wins and losses better, but they can perform better against betting firms. So I got a 2% profit on using the best odds. And then you can use the coefficients, which can be ranked and may highlight those performing well in their specific leagues. So it could have applications for scouting there. So that's everything I want to talk about today. I'll come into the questions now. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Gary. So I've got one question that I'll just kick off with.
Sure.
So I was wondering, so it kind of ties into the very last point you made there. So do teams, to your knowledge, use not necessarily this model, but models like this when they are actually scouting players to identify opportunities or like good players they might have missed otherwise? Is that something that teams currently do very much?
I would think that they will use some kind of modeling in order to try and inform some of their scouting process. I doubt that they're necessarily using a database that will capture so many leagues at once. I think quite often they will be told, hey, I want to focus on this league or look at that league, and they'll build perhaps a model around that particular league or some well-known ones. But the main reason I think, to be honest, that they're not going to use such an extensive database of 25 leagues at once is because it is incredibly hard to just get the data in the first place. So for me, it took a good number, 6 months, even just to kind of get all the data from the website. And that was not by doing it by hand. So, I think they make informed decisions from which they build their scouting models on. But, they won't have something like this, which in theory you could put into any league. It doesn't have to be football, where it's just like, oh, you want maybe some random league in a country that you don't really follow to scout the players there. I can just get the lineups, plug it in, and see generally who's looking to perform well. So I don't think they quite do this, but also there's a little bit of, I think, friction between traditional scouts and some of the more analytical scouts where they think they're perhaps imposing on their territory. So I think they've not quite made the harmony yet that they might do a bit more easily in American sports, where it tends to be a lot more acceptable.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, thanks very much. So there's a question from Ailith in the chat, and then I see James has got his hand raised. So I'll do Ailith first and then jump across to James. So Ayla says, really interesting, Guy. Did you consider using dimension reduction methods to get an idea of which groups of variables were most important for prediction?
Yeah, so this is I think one of the tricky questions of it, because if you're thinking of like reduction and maybe perhaps bringing out some of the variables and so on, it can be quite hard if you're wanting to like take out specific players or group players in some way that could help, certainly with prediction. So I think, yeah, it could potentially work if you're wanting to predict, just the outcomes. But in this case, I also wanted their individual contributions. And to me, I don't think there's necessarily an obvious way that I can think of that I would just, choose to ignore players so much. So the only closest thing I did really was try and make the cutoff point for the players in the data set to try and reduce it a bit. But if you know of techniques, perhaps they could make this a bit easier to manage while still keeping the contributions to the players, I'm definitely open to it. But certainly from reading in the literature, I've not found one yet. And other scholars that I've talked to who do something in this area, they maybe split the players by position and so on, but their data sets don't tend to be quite as large, because I'm already at about 2 billion cells, and if I start splitting up any more, every player suddenly becomes different position variables. It's just going to get a bit much, because it takes already, I think, 4 hours to run the model. So, yeah,
okay.
it's quite tough, I think, to balance that.
Cool.
Another question, I think, in the chat.
Yeah, I think Dave just went on mute.
Okay, there's a mute. I'll get the question. Any difference between group stage and knockout in terms of predictive accuracy? I've not looked just yet on that front. So the model will, if it's I believe it goes by the final score even after extra time if it is a knockout game in Europe. So that is kind of a assumption I have to run with, is that in theory we're putting the players in and seeing who wins. There is a little bit of extra time that might be added on to specific games, but it's such a small subset that I don't think it would matter too much in the long run. But I think that's a good idea. I might look and see how it performs potentially at the top end of players compared to some of the leagues or like the inter-European competition, because that's really where it's trying to separate the good players from the weaker players. So if that does a good job there, then perhaps I could be a bit more confident in the estimates or see where it could be improved.
Okay, thanks for that. I think I might ask, so there's another question appeared in the chat, but I might ask maybe if you want to just reply to that in the chat so that we can move on to, quickly James's comment and then the next talk. I'll
do that.
Best of time. Thanks.
Cool.
Yep.
So, yeah, James, if you want to just quickly, whatever you were going to comment.
Yeah, sure. Just quickly, Guy. I mean, one question was going to be, it's one of those annoying questions, which is with the best price. Obviously, you're assuming that someone can jump between different betting companies to get that best price, and I guess there might be costs of doing so in terms of making sure you've got an account on every betting company. That's just an annoying question, but the kind of the more I think thing that interests me a little bit, being a fan of a lower league club, is the extent to which you've got all these different leagues and you're able to compare players. I wonder if you can also then bring in the lower leagues in England, the lower leagues in Scotland. You mentioned scouts. You maybe you can therefore say, well, whether it's worth sending someone out to these random leagues or whether actually the players that are in the lower leagues in these locally, of equal kind of quality to these players all around Europe.
Yeah, you can absolutely. And yeah, in theory, you could just bring in as many leagues as you want. I think the difficulty will be, one is that you could probably do it just on countries on their own and bring in the tier there. But if you want to really compare them across different leagues within Europe, you'll need some kind of measure of how strong the league structure tends to be, in which case you'll need to try and bring in the European results, I think, regardless, because there'd be no other way of determining whether like the English third tier, how it compares to the Finnish second tier, for example. So yeah, it's a lot of data to gather in, but definitely possible if you have the time to bring it all through.
Yeah, but thanks, Guy. Really interesting.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks very much, Guy. So if you could just stop sharing your screen, that would be grand, thanks. Our next speaker is going to be James Reid, who is the head of the Department of Economics at the University of Reading. And he's going to be talking about the long shadow of an infection, COVID-19 and performance at work, and I believe focusing on the performance of soccer players after infection with COVID-19. So I will pass over to James and let him get started. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. It's really good to be here. I'm pleased also to say that I've certainly spotted Benedict in the room. I didn't see whether Kai is able to make it, but thankfully my co-authors are here, so they can answer all the really tough questions that you may have. But as mentioned, this is we're looking at COVID-19 and the impact of a COVID-19 infection on performance at work. And so to set the scene, not telling anybody anything new, there's been this virus going around the last nearly 2 years now, COVID-19, with a substantial economic impact. I looked, and as of today, there's been over 10 million COVID-19 infections here in the UK. And of course, any economic policy or any policy related to mitigating this has naturally over the last 2 years restricted economic activity. But a kind of related question that I think has had some attention, but perhaps not as much as it might, is the extent to which a COVID-19 infection may subsequently restrict economic activity. And obviously, we hear about deaths and so on, but what about the impact actually of COVID-19 cases? Could there be some kind of longer-term impact? And so what we do in this paper is we look at footballers, professional football players, for all sorts of reasons, but not least because of the data that's available when it comes to certainly elite footballers around Europe. We have data collected by a range of websites. We take one in particular, which gives us action by action data. But we also rely on the fact that there's been, over the last 2 years, a very stringent or very rigorous testing framework in place across the top football leagues around Europe in particular. So you've got a uniquely accurate soccer testing scheme and this high frequency performance data. And so we ask whether a COVID-19 infection affects the likelihood that a footballer plays and affects the performance of a player if he plays after his infection. And what we find is evidence to suggest that there is a significant and persistent deterioration in worker productivity due to COVID-19. So in terms of setting the scene with literature, there are obviously a number of papers, an increasing number of papers that look at the impact of COVID-19 policy interventions, and a few are listed there that are in our paper. And then also just as Dave mentioned, perhaps sport isn't the obvious setting for thinking about things like this, but sport data is commonly used, certainly in economics. Guy listed a few things and listed work by Stefan Szymanski in particular, but there's a nice paper by Bartley last year, basically asking what can we learn from sport about the wider world, and there's a range of papers listed here. But sport offers a lot of data, and information on decisions being made and also outcomes, and certainly from the perspective of economists who are interested in the impact of decisions on outcomes, this is quite a nice setting. And then just in terms of back to COVID-19, there have been studies of the impact of COVID-19 on individuals, the recovery times, and how people have been returning. In our particular context, as I mentioned, we're looking at footballers. There's been a study that we found looking at Belgian footballers and taking, it was a small sample because they were able to take quite detailed measurements of the individuals who were infected and who weren't, and they found a significant effect that dissipated over time of a COVID-19 infection. So in turning to the data that we use, we're looking at Germany and Italy, not least because that's where we know and we're able to identify the vast majority of the known cases, both in the 2019-20 and 2020-21 seasons. So of those 81 positive tests in the COVID-19 testing regime in Germany, 76 we could identify, and of the 176 positive tests in Italy, we were able to identify 157. The picture you can see here is the solid line is the general incidence of COVID-19 in Italy on the left and Germany on the right, and the incidence amongst players. You can see some level of correlation, if you like, between the different waves in the different countries in terms of players contracting it. In terms of the footballing data, this data is collected from the website whoscored.com, which presents Opta data, which is individual actions on the ball in a football match. And so what I present you a picture of here is the XY coordinates of actions during the 1920 Bundesliga season, where the black dots are all the actions. You see this, the legend at the bottom there. The red dots are all the aerial actions. So a subset of all actions are the ones that are some kind of a header by one player in some kind of a contest with another player to win control of the ball. And then we've got green dots, which you can see over here, are the shots. So these XY coordinates are always that the player in control of the ball is shooting from, as you look at this screen, left to right. So green are where most of the shots take place. You see also aerial duels happening quite a lot defensively, with the red dots there quite more prevalent. And then blue dots here are the actual goals, where there's a small number of blue dots here. You might not be able to see them, but they are own goals. So this is a very thorough data set. It gives us 72,000 observations from 1,406 players over the two countries, Italy and Germany. Here's a set of summary statistics on these players, and we look at both the mean for a number of these variables amongst those players that were not infected and those that were infected pre-infection. So we get some sense of whether there's any difference in the players that were infected by COVID-19 relative to those that weren't, and we can see a few differences. So you see the difference in the third column of numbers here, with the stars indicating if that difference with a pairwise t-test is statistically significant. And so we see that the players that were infected tended to be those that were involved in games, so more likely to play a little bit longer, more likely to be midfield players, as well as you can see from down here at the bottom in terms of where their position is, and slightly more likely to be in Italy as well, but that arguably reflects the impact of the first wave, which hit northern Italy quite strongly, which is where a lot of the football teams in Italy are located. But you can also see from this table the kinds of things that we can look at when we're trying to evaluate the impact of a COVID-19 infection on what you might consider to be workplace productivity. These are the actions that a football player gets involved with in a given football match. We've got passes, ball recoveries, the touches that they make, which is obviously similar to passes but not restricted to passes, the possession, the amount of times they run with the ball, aerial duels, so again headed challenges with other players, and also shots on goal as well, things that we look at. We've got a little bit of demographic information as well. And I guess just to quickly pause, and since I've not said yet, is obviously footballers are a very unique subsection of the workforce. Nonetheless, they are participating in what's a physically demanding workplace, and there are other workplaces that are physically demanding. You can think of perhaps construction being one. And of course, footballers are also in a mentally demanding profession as well, because while they have to be cognizant of what's happening around them, making sure that they're up with the game and making the right kinds of choices and decisions with what their actions are in and around the game for 90 minutes or longer. And again, there are plenty of, if you like, more mentally demanding tasks as well. So there are aspects, ways in which we feel that what we're doing has more general applications. And as I've hinted at already, we've got the information from a very uniquely accurate testing regime where we know all the players that got infected. It isn't that we miss some of the players that got infected because they were all being tested multiple times a week. In fact, the regimes were slightly different in Germany and Italy. In Germany, players would have 1 or 2 tests a week, depending on the local prevalence of COVID-19, plus a test per match. So you could imagine that players could have up to 4 tests per week. By and large, it wasn't often that the local area had sufficiently few cases that the player would have just 1 test a week. In Italy, it was a PCR test before each match. And our setup is what's commonly referred to as a differences regression setup, where we look at some kind of performance measure, performance PM, for a player in a match M, and then we model this on the dummy that I've mentioned already, which is 1 after a player was infected, 0 beforehand, or 0, of course, for a player that was never affected in match by match M in the data set. So beta is our differences coefficient that we're particularly interested in, and we also control for a range of those characteristics, because if we're thinking about the standard treatment effect type framework, it's not necessarily the case that all of these players were randomly treated, if you like, with COVID-19. So it's important to control for various aspects that might help to predict, as we saw in the previous table, the incidence of COVID-19. And then we've got fixed effects, where we control for, as Guy gave a very thorough account of the fixed effects, but to say that we include some fixed effects as well for players and teams. We also try and explore the dynamic effects of an infection as well, rather than just looking at pre and post. We also look at the number of games pre and post in what's quite a conventional event study setting, where we split things up into days before and days after an infection into 75-day bins. And again, this will perhaps make a bit more sense when I show you some of the results in a moment. But this helps us to understand the dynamic patterns of a COVID-19 infection. Finally, as economists, we're often interested in more the team effects, the overall productivity effects of teams relative to the individuals, the spillovers as they're often referred to as. And so, and then in a sporting context, we're perhaps quite interested in, well, is my team going to be affected if a few players have got COVID-19? And so we look at that as well. And I'm just in terms of getting to the results, we've got a range of plots for the results, and so let me take you through some of these now. First of all, we can think about what we refer to as the extensive margin. Do these players play more or less? And this is your event time study approach, where we've got the time before an infection. So this is, if you like, a test of whether or not it's often referred to as parallel trends, and there's no obvious trend prior to an infection. There's nothing known prior to somebody getting an infection. But then they're infected, and initially there's a big drop in the likelihood that they are to play a game. Some of that will, of course, be because they have to isolate, being quarantined for a while. But of course, equally, some of that will be the effect of the COVID-19 infection as well, and the amount of time that they're sidelined for. That quickly recovers, to within the margin of error, so it's not significantly different from 0. But you can see that as we get to 225 or more days after the infection, there's still about a 5% reduced likelihood that a player plays, even if it is only borderline significant. So that's on the likelihood of playing, what we refer to as the extensive margin. We can think similarly about minutes, because playing is one thing, but the number of minutes you might play for only 5 or 10 minutes because you're not able to do any more than that post-COVID infection. We see that with minutes, a similar profile, a big initial drop, and a slower recovery. So you can imagine this must mean that players are coming back and playing smaller amounts of time, even if they are named in the starting lineup or named as substitutes. And again, that's still negative up to a year afterwards, although again, statistically insignificant. Our main measure of activity, of productivity, is passes, the number of passes a player makes in a game. And you might ask, why is that the case? There's precedent. There are a number of papers in the literature that use passing as a measure of productivity. And appealing to those of you that watch football, well, football is a highly fluid game with lots of passing taking place. Teams will make many hundreds of passes in a given game. And if you're within that team, you have to make sure you're up with play, you're in time with the game, up to speed, up to fitness, and able to be playing a full part in the game. And if you can't, you'll make fewer passes. You won't be in the right place to receive the pass, and you may not be cognizant, well aware enough to then make a pass in return. You may be dispossessed because you're too slow to react, for example. So we argue that passes, or we would argue that passes is a good measure of performance. And what you can see with passes is that the effect of this over time, remember, this is only, of course, if they're playing, so there isn't that initial drop that we see in terms of minutes. This is the intensive margin, so when these players are playing, you start to see that this effect, well, it's negative and it's persisting. So even up to a year afterwards, 225 and more days afterwards, that's a significantly negative effect, slightly more than 5% fewer passes being made by these players in any given game. So it seems like a significant impact on player productivity of having a COVID-19 infection. There are other measures. We haven't just looked at passes. We can look at short and long passes here. We can look at, we mentioned ball recoveries, how much distance are you covering, whether you're making interceptions to keep up with the game, and then measures about, again, going back to the extensive margin of whether you make it to full time or not, or you're in the starting 11. So other measures, but you can see generally a negative effect of a COVID-19 infection. There's heterogeneity, of course. There's heterogeneity by age. That is, the younger players are those that are least affected, those that are under 25, players that are 20 to 30, slightly more affected, and the relatively older players, and again, this is old in a footballing sense rather than old in a more general sense, but you can see a similar pattern here to what we observe in the broader population. The effect on older players is stronger, more like about 11% relative to the 4 or 5% for younger players. We can think about the impact of how many days there are between games, because when football returned after the initial COVID-19 break, the season was condensed, so there are lots and lots of matches playing on the weekend, in the midweek, on the weekend. And again, perhaps as you might expect, the lower the rest day, the number of rest days, the worse the performance. So 0 to 3 rest days, a worse performance. There's a bit of a slightly better performance for 4 to 7 days, because that's arguably the more common rest day. So perhaps players are conditioned to have 7 days between games, and again, an effect 8 to 11 days. You might think, well, is COVID-19 different from other kinds of injuries? The answer is yes. So we look here at COVID-19 in red, and other short or long-term injuries when you return from them. And you can see that the COVID-19 effect, as we saw already, is significant, but for other injuries, there's no long-term effect. Is COVID different from other respiratory illnesses? Another question worth asking as well, in terms of checking the impact of COVID-19. Is it really different from other kinds of respiratory illnesses? And the answer again is yes, it appears, with the COVID-19 dots being red and the other respiratory illnesses, flu and whatever, being insignificantly different from 0, the impact of those kinds of injury types. I mentioned team spillovers, so I'll just quickly show you those. We split the distribution of those effects on teams into the quartiles, so the least affected teams in the first, second, and third quartile in terms of the team spillover on team passes. And there's a negative bin significant effect the more you're being affected, but it's the teams affected the most in the highest quartile that have a significantly negative effect on their passing. So a spillover of those individual effects. And I will stop there in the interest of time and say that, well, we've analysed the causal effect of a COVID-19 infection on the productivity of high-performance workers. We found that productivity drops substantially and persistently by about 5%. And of course, this then has implications for thinking about government policy when combating COVID-19. There are obvious questions about the generalizability of this, but we would argue that, yes, footballers are quite different, distinct in their nature, but equally there are aspects of what they're doing that are generalizable, and we have a particularly effective way of identifying the impact of COVID-19 infections within this particular group of performers. So I'll stop there, and I will invite questions.
Thanks very much, James. That was very interesting. So there's a couple of questions in the chat already. So first up, there's a question from Kenneth Humphreys asking if you looked to see if there was any difference between different ethnic groups at all.
I don't think we've done that yet.
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of. As if Benedict and Kai are here, they can say for sure, but I don't think we had that level of detail. I mean, obviously, we know within the UK that there's been different prevalences amongst different ethnic groups, but I don't think we've been able to do that so far.
Okay, thanks very much. Next question from Alan Owen. Probably difficult to answer at this stage, but would it be possible to see if these effects have improved over time? For example, as more players have been vaccinated, the impact of COVID on them may have lessened.
Yeah, thanks. And nice to see you, Alan. I'll hear from you or see what you've written down. Thanks for the question. We split into early and late effects. So obviously those that were infected very early in the pandemic, you might imagine were different because treatments are now better now. And I can't remember off the top of my head what the difference is. Again, Kai and Benedict might be able to help me there. And also in terms of the vaccination, Benedict's answers, that's good. In terms of the vaccination, we ended at the end of the last season, so last summer. And in principle, therefore, none of the players had been vaccinated. Obviously, we know since that some still haven't been vaccinated, even though they've had the chance to be vaccinated.
Okay, and a question from Chris. Although the COVID effect is very different, could a local epidemic be modelled using similar methods, or would the level of data need to be much larger?
As in a flu, for example, or something like that, a flu epidemic or something, or?
I'm not sure, Chris, if you maybe, yeah, something like that, he says.
I mean, I think in principle, if the data was there, yes, I think that would certainly be feasible. Obviously, the thing that we have with COVID-19 in particular is this very clear testing regime, which enables us to identify the players that were definitely affected versus those that weren't. So that's what makes that quite distinct and quite useful. But yeah, in principle, we could.
Okay. And a quick question from Guy before we move on. Do you think this may have partly caused more uncommon league winners in the top leagues of Europe, as top teams had more international players and some players caught COVID on international duty?
Good question. I'm noticing that we're already at 10-7 though, and I don't want to take away from Johan's talk. I think, yeah, I don't know is the quick answer, Guy. Obviously, there's been some variation, but then Bayern Munich won the Bundesliga, so perhaps not.
Okay, thanks very much. So yeah, in the interest of time, we'll move on to Johan now. So if you could just stop sharing your screen, and Johan, if you could share yours, that would be great. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Our next speaker is Johan Rewilak. I hope I've pronounced that correctly.
Spot on.
Excellent. He is a lecturer in economics, finance, and entrepreneurship at Aston University, and he is going to take a bit of a change of tack from the football that we've heard about so far and talk a bit about the Olympic Games.
Not what we want. I'm sorry, but I'll just get rid of that one. Close that share tray. That's not what we're having. Let me just see if I can share a different window. So presenting that one. Let me find what I'm going to try and just give me a second. Upload from my computer. Hopefully this is the one that we've got. There we go. That looks more like it.
Yep, that looks good to me. Thanks.
Super. So I'll try and abridge this slightly to make some time up for us all. But typically what this work is it's a bit of a combination of my work and some work I've done alongside James as well, Carl Singleton and Dominic Schreier as well, looking at home advantage at Olympic Games. A little bit of a review about what's already been done, but it's more of a message of what else can be done. And it's quite nicely titled in the sense that what we know already, what's the pre-existing studies tell us, but a lot of the kind of the weaknesses as well, and what we don't know, and what we'd also like to know, especially when it comes to using statistics in sports and building models and so forth. There's also a little snippet in there which answers one of Guy's questions in the presentation. I think that was yourself, David, about how do football clubs use these models, and there's a nice little story there. Obviously being recorded, I'm going to use player X and club Y and so forth, which is in the slides. So to protect anonymity there, but there's a nice story in showing you that actually they do things quite simply sometimes, which is hopefully quite interesting. Okay, so to make a start, when the Olympic Games come around every 4 years, in particular the Summer Olympics, we try to make a prediction on who is going to top the medal rostrum. The first graph here is just looking at predicted performance versus actual performance within sample, where you've got the black line there being the 45-degree line. And obviously, if every single dot was on that point, you'd say it's an absolute perfect prediction, but we can see most of the dots there are relatively close to the 45-degree line. So in this sense, you'd probably say, hang on a second, you've done quite a good job with your model there, which you've created. Okay, so this figure is very simple. And looking at this model is just effectively looking at a lag-dependent variable. So looking at current performance based on past performance. And with this, it's only using one lag. So just using one single lag gives us quite a nice prediction. And when we look at Olympic performance at the Summer Olympic Games. Now, that's not overly informative for us, but it gives us some good results. And if I was going to go around and put my money on who's going to top the medal rostrum in 2024 in Paris, I'm probably going to put my money on the United States. And what we can see here, that typically past performance is a good predictor of the future. And we've got some rankings here of some select nations, the top 2 and then 3 random ones. And Spain actually is quite an interesting one to look at, which we'll talk about more in detail later on. So with the exception of the games being hosted in China, the USA have topped the medal rostrum at the previous 5 Olympiads. And one reason potentially why they came second in Beijing was the home advantage effect, which we will come on to very shortly. If you look at the UK, traditionally we've been a top 10 nation over the past, say, 16, 20 years. And since Beijing, we've been pretty much a consistent top 5 performer. When we start to look at Spain, they're roughly around the high teens, a little bit of variation. Belarus, were in the 20s. Now I'm predicting they're probably around the 40s. And then Venezuela, roughly a bit more variation. So what we know so far, if we look at past performance, is that towards the top of the rostrum, it does a much better job. But when you go towards the bottom of the rostrum, there's a lot more variability when it comes to using just previous performance as a predictor of future performance. Okay. And when we look at this, looking at past performance, it doesn't tell us much. And what we'd like to know is what actually drives Olympic success. Because if you look at just saying that the United States are always going to win it, there's no incentive. Policymakers are not going to be interested, and they're going to try and break that mold. Likewise, if you're in a developing country, which is trying to promote sport, we know that finances are tight in developing countries, your policymakers are not actually going to bow down to these pressure groups when they say, well, the evidence suggests that because we finished bottom, nothing's going to change that. Okay, so this is why it's quite important. But there has been a lot of literature there which has looks at other characteristics in terms of what explains Olympic performance. And there's a seminal paper in Restat there, which is by Bernard and Boos, which talks about income and population being the key drivers, where obviously if you have a large population and a random distribution of athletes centered around the globe, a large population, you're more likely to have higher caliber athletes from the population in the world. Income as well, if you have resources to train these athletes, it's more likely that you're going to do well. There's also information in terms of hosting, where the home advantage effect shows that it's very positive, and politics as well seems to matter. In particular, there's this argument with politics about the Soviet Union versus the United States, where the Soviet Union were trying to engineer Olympic success to show the prowess of their political system, and likewise the United States were trying to do the same. Now, when we look at this from a between variation perspective, we see lots of variation between countries. And as we'll see shortly, when we focus on the between variation, we get quite a lot of these variables coming up statistically significant. However, if we look at the lag dependent variable, is it a case that it's just past success predicts future success, or is it there's some inherent characteristics of the countries that do very well that just means they will be successful? And one way we can test that is just looking at the within variation between within variation of countries rather than the between variation. So analogous to a fixed effects specification. Now, when we're looking at the Olympic Games, we know that a lot of countries actually don't perform well at the Olympics and don't win any medals whatsoever, which means that normally the models used are Tobit models. And as we're all very aware, a fixed effects Tobit does not exist. So how do we tease this out? Well, in my study, I looked at using the Mundlach correction, where we enter the country means or the unit means into the regression alongside it to make it analogous to a fixed effects specification. So we can see how much within variation is driving these results. So you could answer, well, that's just probably uninformative because it says country-specific effects are important, but that actually might be informative in its own right. If you look at, say, Kenya and Ethiopia in the Rift Valley, they produce fantastic middle and long distance runners purely because of the location where they are. It's nature and geography that seem to be driving their success in middle and long distance running. And there's also potential selection problems. And we can look at those in terms of who sends who, or who sends which athletes to which events. If you look at Middle Eastern countries, many didn't have female delegates at the Olympic Games for a very long time, which is leading to some selectivity issues there too. So I'm just going to move on to some results here, which is looking at a slide which shows when we start to mess around with these models, how things differ and what actually remains consistent. So when we look at the Tobit, the standard Tobit, which focuses on the between variation, we see that 3 of those 4 variables that we mentioned in the previous screen using data from 96 to 2016 matters for Olympic success. However, when we start to focus on the within variation, so the second column there looking at the Mundlach transform, the only thing that matters now is the host effect. And then you can say that maybe there's a 2-stage process going on here about these variables, which hasn't been really looked at too much in the literature. Whether it's the case that certain characteristics drive if you actually win a medal or not, but then other characteristics drive how many medals or the number of medals you actually win in total. And with a 2-stage model, a hurdle model, using the Krag hurdle model, we see that actually population and hosting determine whether or not you actually are successful, but it's typically the host effect that explains how many medals or the number of medals in different events you are successful in. Okay, so that's going to move us on to a little bit to home advantage and exactly what component of home advantage results in being a strong performer at the Olympic Games, in particular the Summer Olympics. Well, there are a few different stories why home advantage may matter. First of all is to do with fatigue, and that can be travel fatigue. So athletes are rested if you're playing under a home crowd. There may be familiarity of race routes, or you may have a specific knowledge of, let's say, for example, in water sports, in kayaking, you might know very well where the rapids are going to be the most vital. You get practice on these routes and perform better. Or it could be crowd effects. Now, James has done quite a lot of work here in terms of association football, showing that the crowd doesn't matter as much as we anticipate beforehand, where I believe it was only the yellow cards for the visiting side were reduced when it came down to association football. What I think in terms of home advantage is it's a case that you mobilize resources towards sport. And we can look at this from a study that me, James, Carl and Dominic did, examining home advantage at Olympic Games. And what we found is that we have both ex ante effects and ex post effects, as well as effects when you're hosting the Olympic Games, when you are hosting, okay? So the idea is that Olympic hosts are known several years in advance, and you start your preparations in terms of what we're doing. As a result, we have a situation where we move on. Sorry, I don't know what's happened there with the slides there. So I don't know if you can still see that in a quite large size. But what we have
looks fine to me, yeah.
Yeah, what we have there is that we have ex ante effects and ex post effects when we're for home advantage. And it's also, we find that it could be a case that it's mobilization towards sport, which is the reason why home advantage works. However, when we change the definition of success, this graph here shows actually potentially that Spain are the true Olympians. And when we look at the change of definition of successes, is how many different sports or disciplines are we successful in? And what we have here is we have a 45-degree, we have a line there, which is our line of best fit. And the ranking and number of medals is on the x-axis, but the ranking and number of sports is on the y-axis. So if you look at the top left, where we've got Kenya, Jamaica, and Ethiopia, they rank really highly in the number of medals, but they rank really lowly in the number of sports because all their success is in track and field. Jamaica in the sprinting, Kenya and Ethiopia in the long distance running. If we look at Spain at the bottom of the graph, ESP just by 20, Spain are one of the most successful Olympic nations in getting medals in multiple disciplines and sports, but they just don't win that many in each single one. So they may win a gold event in kayaking, one silver in fencing and so forth, rather than a gold, silver and bronze in the 100 meters. So the questions are, what are we doing badly, potentially? Are we actually asking the right questions? Are we looking at the right variables? And sometimes it leads to an idea that simple things can do well. So when we look to model these things or explains Olympic performance, we start to go into these higher levels of modeling. The very first slide showed that a very simple model can predict things very well and can forecast very well in sports. Now I'm going to give us a little story about this football club who were looking to replace a striker a few years ago. So the striker scored, I think it was about just over 20 goals for the season for this club, this Premier League club. And they knew he was going at the end of the year and they sold this player on. And this football club did a very simple job where they looked at Europe's top leagues, didn't even weight the leagues in terms of the strength of the leagues. They just said, who scored a similar number of goals as our player? And they went through a list. Number 1, he'll never come to us. Number 2, too expensive. Number 3, he's attainable. And they went ahead and just did that simple thing, looked at who scored a similar number of goals as a striker that was vacated. As it turns out, when they had him in the first season, he did rather well. He scored a goal every 3 games, which just shows that simple things can be done well. But there's also this trade-off, what we have, that sometimes you need to do better modelling because, as we know, as a law of large numbers occurs and our samples become a lot bigger, this player starts to perform very poorly after this initial first 6 months, scoring a goal every 3 games. And this links to what we can talk about moving forwards. We know there's lots of data everywhere, but sometimes it's getting better data. When it comes to Olympic performance, is it better macro data? For example, spending on sports rather than just income per capita. Will that help us? Do we need some micro-based evidence? So rather than looking at these big, heavy aggregates of countries, do we need to look at individual athletes? But we may have some problems there as well, which I call the financial forecasting problem. If you're a successful athlete, you're not probably going to provide the data because you don't want your rivals copying your training habits and your methods of being successful. There's also clean identification strategies. We really struggle here, especially when it comes to the Olympic Games and looking to predict performance. So the UK policy, if I go back a few slides, we noticed that the UK were 20th in Athens, and then, 10th in Athens, and then in the top 5 in the next subsequent games. What was it that drove that policy change? Was it a case that it was because we hosted the London 2012 Olympics and we mobilized resources towards sport? Or was it the case in 2002, after the Commonwealth Games, we had the velodrome built in Manchester and it was a really targeted, specific sports strategy? So it's very difficult to find out a clean identification strategy to find out exactly what it is that's driving success. And I know I'm preaching to a lot of statisticians here. It's the horrible word. Do we potentially need to actually speak to these athletes and get a bit more qualitative data to supplement our quantitative data, what we have? I am mindful for time and I have abridged a few things, but I'm open to questions, and thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Johan. I've got a quick question that I'd like to jump off with. I noticed we were talking about the ex ante and ex post effects, and it looked like pretty much everything was significant apart from for women before the Olympics. And I was just wondering if you had any more insights into why basically that was the case.
That's a watch this space moment. So I'm out trying to do something there to try and explain some things like differences in gender that we actually see. At the moment, what's on the top of my mind is that once the facilities are built, it's maybe a case that we're going to start to participate in sport more. I think a lot of the gender difference stuff that occurs is to do with participation factors. And that's from my GSE article as well, which basically looks at performance at Olympic Games. We find out the magnitude or the effect is quite larger for males compared to females in certain aspects. And actually speaking to one or two athletes, I'm obviously not going to name them at the time when it's been recorded, but one of them mentioned there was a big issue about sponsorship and pregnancy and participation. So once they got pregnant, they lost all the sponsorship funding and have not received it since afterwards, which may be something. And there's some institutional things, in my opinion, that are going on that are creating these messes, in my opinion.
Okay, thanks very much. So there is a question in the chat. I think it appeared quite early in your talk, saying you were focusing on rankings, but how close were total medals between each of these different ranks at the Olympics?
Right. Yes. So how it's been worked here is we've controlled for the fact that as we get more and more into the future, we get more and more events occur at the Olympic Games. So we've weighted this in terms of performance. So, for example, it's a Fibonacci sequence where a finalist position is worth 1 point, a bronze medal is worth 2, a silver is worth 3 points, and a gold is worth 5 points. And we've done it in terms of a share. So, for example, by winning a medal, winning a component of the share means there's less of a share available for everybody else in the the reigning points available for all remaining countries effectively. So that's hopefully how it's actually kind of made it consistent.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat at the moment. So I will just take this opportunity just now to say a massive thank you to all three of our speakers. I think there was everyone will agree, 3 really interesting talks there, and I really enjoyed that. So if everyone can maybe use the little applause function just to say thanks very much to the speakers.